what's that got to do with it? You don't own anything in Honolulu either.
Yes, I do. Another fellow and I own a canning factory there.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Eamonn Keogh, who is the co-founder of FarmSense and who's also a professor of computer science at the University of California, Riverside. Thanks for joining, Eamonn.
Great to be here.
All right. So you are a pioneer when it comes to the field of computational entomology, or the scientific study of insects. So, it's not surprising that you have developed this underlying IP for FlightSensor as part of your spin-out startup, FarmSense. So if you could talk a little bit about what is FarmSense and how are you using optical sensors to auto-classify insects and to do the count of the number of insects?
Sure. So FarmSense is an information company, and we fill information need that growers have. So growers and farmers all over the world have insects that attack their crops. For example, if you have almonds, the insect might be the navel orange worm. If you have apples, the insect might be the codlin moth. And these insects do a lot of damage to your crops. You can intervene if you know where the insects are, when they've arrived, sometimes down to the level of sex and species. But getting information today is really very difficult. It's a mechanical process. Like I can kind of demo it. This is a classic sticky trap, and growers would place this in the field. They'd walk out every 2 weeks. They'd count the insects in this, and then based upon some model, they figure out I should do a broadcast spray or do some kind of intervention. And this, of course, is really very slow and clumsy. It's very expensive, all the human labor. So the question we asked a couple years ago was, could we actually help these growers? Could we give them the information they want directly to the iPhone or to the laptop? And could we give the information in real time? Because like almost any other problem, information gets stale pretty quickly. If you know about bugs 2 weeks after they've arrived, it's too late to really intervene. If you know today, you can intervene very effectively. So this is kind of the motivation for what we did. And what we did actually is figure out, could we build a sensor to put in the field that would track the insects, and when they arrive, could actually measure some signals from them and tease out from that the sex, the species, even the life stage of the insects, and give that to the grower.
Yeah, I think this notion of heightened real-time data, of course, is absolutely necessary, in my opinion. I guess the question that I have is, which is more basic, which is, for a lot of these farmers, they've been in the business for sometimes generations, so they have pretty good pattern recognition already in terms of certain peaks and values of insect and infestations and so forth.
Actually, you'd be surprised. Often that actually isn't the case. So let me give you one kind of typical example. We talked to one grower who used these sticky traps, but they're so difficult and effective to use. He basically converts upon the following algorithm, which is on Easter Sunday, he would spray, and he sprayed for the next 12 Sundays every year. And it seemed to work for him, to be fine. But with our sensor in the field, we actually told him, I need to actually spray twice a year. And the best days would have been this year, that Wednesday and that Thursday. So basically now his labor costs have dramatically decreased, his pesticide costs have decreased, and so on and so forth. So they do have some kind of anecdotal information. They have some, hard-fought information. But first of all, it can be wrong. And secondly, it can change. As you probably know, insects are very sensitive to climate change. And so the pattern you saw 2 years ago might actually happen this year. Another example is some insects typically have 2 generations per season. And now with climate change, you actually have 3 generations per season. And so your information simply is out of date. You need real-time information in most cases.
Yeah, I really appreciate the fact that you got preemptive, because that's kind of where I was trying to drive the conversation, is that, yes, I think historically there may have been some patterns, but that normal distribution doesn't always hold. And certainly we have some large changing factors driven by climate change that is really, making things much more volatile. And the other thing that I think you mentioned, which I think it's very important for us to recognize, is that really, aside from the yield and the harvest component, is this method will actually allow for the farmers to use less synthetic pesticides, right? Which not only has a cost, but also cost to the farmers, but also externalities to the environment as well.
Absolutely. So they say that the production, fermentation, and use of pesticides is about 6% of global climate change, the carbon dioxide produced. So if you reduce pesticide use, you kind of win there. And pesticides actually do, of course, kill bees, which we really need bees. They actually also killed some birds and other animals. It gets into the water table. I mean, pesticides actually one of humankind's greatest inventions, but nevertheless, the less we use, the better. Another problem is if you use pesticides all the time, insects become resistant very quickly. If you use pesticides more sparingly, insects become resistant not at all or very slowly.
Yeah, it's a very interesting optimization problem, because in this case, it's about least, right? So you want to be able to use the pesticide as least frequently throughout the year, and still be able to have full control over what's happening with the insects.
Exactly. And sometimes that can be zero pesticides. So one example is there are some bugs that if you wait too late to discover them, you basically are forced to use pesticides. But if you know ahead of time or just in time, you can actually do biocontrol. For example, these tiny wasps you can purchase very cheaply, you release them, check market field, and they go find the larvae of the bad bugs and basically kill them. And so now you have no pesticides, you're completely organic, and your cost is 1% of the original cost of pesticides. So with good information, you can intervene in all kinds of ways that are much less harmful to the environment and a lot cheaper.
Yeah, I really like this last one that you brought up, which is that in organic farming techniques, there are lots of interesting ways that farmers do intervene, but it requires more timely information. And I think this is exactly what you're talking about. So I want to go into the kind of the underlying, technology here. If you could break down the system, what it's involved in terms of, I would imagine there's some computer vision that's involved in basic counting. What about the actual classifiers in terms of insect classification and the database that's behind that?
Sure. Let me sort of show you what this thing would look like in the field. So here's the device placed in the field. It's kind of a delta trap. It's solar powered. It's come on here. And inside here is an attractant that attracts insects. And they're kind of specific, but not perfectly so. So bugs arrive and they go into the trap. And just inside the trap here is our sensor. And the sensor works by basically sending a signal across this threshold here. When it goes past this, we extract him or her some information from this insect. And that includes things like how fast the wings are beaten, but some additional facts too. So let me focus on one thing. So if you have a honeybee, it beats its wings about 200 times a second. If you have a cotton moth, it's about 40 times a second, and so on and so forth. So that one fact of how fast the wings are beaten is a very useful clue as to what insect you actually have. It isn't enough, unfortunately. You need to actually extract some other information, but all this information combined together, you can actually classify insects very accurately. And so we use what's called a Bayesian classifier, which is often used to classify text and other things too for this. And we've kind of customized this over the years. It's called an augmented Bayes classifier.
Yeah, this is very exciting. Now, in terms of the sampling, can you talk about how many of these units you would place in on a farm, and how is that sampling representative of the population?
That's a great question. So it depends upon the crop itself. So, for example, for almonds, you're looking at one of those traps I just showed you for every 4 acres. For very high value crops, things like fruits and nuts, ornamental things, you have a high density. For something like corn or grain, you have a much, much lower density. For blueberries, actually, you might actually have 2 or 3 traps per acre because they're so valuable and the insects are so bursty in when they appear and where they appear. So it depends upon the context. But actually, what we try to do is try to make this as familiar as we can for the growers. So this trap actually models the shape of a trap they've been using for decades. The original trap actually is just this sticky stuff. There's no intelligence in it, but we use the same physical shape of the trap, and they put it on the same pole in the same location. So try to exploit the grower's kind of previous familiar history, make the life very easy for him or her.
That's a really interesting kind of a user experience that you guys have figured out. Is that sometimes we can build better mousetraps, but but the fact that you're trying to leverage existing behavior of the farmers and the workers, and even the placement of it, so that the adoption is as minimal as possible. And because it's energy sufficient, independent, there's really no fuss, right? Can you talk about the communication and how that works on a farm?
And so right now, actually, we simply use cell connections, like your iPhone it might be. And it actually works very well in almost all of America, actually all of the world. We have these traps now in Spain and Italy and 5 or 6 American states. And there are some places in Iowa where it's so flat and so little cell coverage, we actually have to use relays and other technologies. But it's actually quite easy to do. And the cool thing actually is that the classification is done on board with some hardware in here. So we only transmit the counts, not the high-level video or anything else like this. But it's almost like in the text. It's very efficient in terms of bandwidth.
Yeah, that's very smart because you're minimizing the packet size, and I mean, count is nothing compared to, let's say, you were doing computer vision and actually sending back the images.
A few bytes versus a few megabytes makes a huge difference in amortizes over a large.
So I think from implementation, it makes a lot of sense. Now, do you foresee that at some point would you consider additional sensors or modalities to be added to the system?
Well, we already do take, so if you put a peak in here, we already actually measure the temperature and humidity. And there's 2 reasons for that. I mentioned the wind frequency of the insects. That actually changes based upon the air density, which depends on temperature and humidity. So we have to know that to kind of correct our model. But in addition, the growers actually want to know, in any case, temperature and humidity on their farm. And that actually can have like little microclimates. It can actually change, 100 meters away. Mm-hmm. So we do actually kind of free information the grower actually also uses. For some of our sensors, actually, we're going to add in wind speed, wind direction, and other sensors too. So we have a nice platform in terms of power management, in terms of wireless. It makes sense to add these other sensors that the growers can actually use. And the thing we'll do now shortly is rain detection and like a kind of digital rain gauge, basically, based upon purely the sound of the rain.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about where you guys are in terms of the product development lifecycle, and have you guys actually gone this into some sort of pilot mode? And ultimately, I'm really interested in terms of farmers' willingness to pay, and if you could also talk about the microeconomics of your business model.
Sure. But in terms of farmers' willingness to pay, I'll just tell you kind of an anecdote, which is we actually have kind of multiple customers who are doing paid trials right now, and in every case, they actually knocked at our door. They'd seen us in an academic, paper or on a blog post, and they basically said, "Please come and help us. We need help." So there's a really big latent demand for this, which kind of gives us some hope people be willing to pay for this. And our market research suggests that is the case. And I'm sorry, your other question was?
Well, actually, I think it was around microeconomics in terms of how you guys price it, and because it's essentially a system, but essentially it's also SaaS as well, right?
Surely. So, I mean, to be clear, we make the amazing sensor, but we're not a sensor company. We're an information company. So we plan to make extra money with a subscription service. So a grower will actually pay a token cost for this, a one-time cost to actually lease or buy this, put it in the field, but they'll actually pay a monthly cost for the information. Okay. The exact monthly cost depends upon the number of sensors it has and the area it covers and so on and so forth. But it'll be competitive, actually very competitive with basically having humans walk around or drive around collecting these traps and manually count them. Understood.
Now, you're very interesting because I think, there are many professors and researchers that are excellent at, very novel, forward-looking research, but very few are able to actually steward that process to commercialization. Can you talk about your personal journey in this regard and how you've been able to get this out of academia into the private sector?
Surely. So actually, I think a lot of help here. So I am kind of a classic academic in many senses, which is kind of good and bad. And so I did this originally as purely an academic project. It was so much fun for me and my students. But I had some colleagues who were more entrepreneurial. And actually, UC Riverside, especially in recent years, under the directorship of like Mike Bazzani, who's the vice chancellor for research, has become much more entrepreneur-friendly. And people kept saying to me, you should patent this, you should commercialize this, and so forth. And so finally, about 4 years ago, I kind of broke down. I kind of assembled a very, very good team around me who are smarter than I am to actually do the kind of business part of this, or to help me with that, basically.
Terrific. That sounds great. Well, I think, as I'm looking at this technology and understanding it a little bit better is that, sometimes the best solution, especially out there that requires hardware, software, and communication is that it's about elegance and simplicity. So I really appreciate the fact that you guys really thought through the user adoption and making sure that you're not, making it overly complicated and overly costly, but making sure that the barrier to entry is as low as possible for potential customers. What is next for both on the product development side, but also on the sales and marketing side for you guys?
So I'm just going to echo that point you mentioned, which is simplicity is really important. And again, I'm not an entomologist, I'm not a grower, so I didn't know these things. So one thing is we have people on our team who have actually done this for a living. They've actually sensitive for a living. And we all basically went out and watched growers from a distance do their day-to-day routines to figure out where the pain points are. So me as an academic, when I first made these sensors, as I should ago, they were quite complicated. And my brilliant co-founder, that was on this thing, actually made them unbelievably simple. This has literally one switch on off, and has literally one button with a few color codes, and that's it. That's simplicity. And growers really demand that. Growers are very smart people, but they're really, really busy people. And they can't be fussing with menus and dip switches, all that kind of stuff. They want to be able to put this there, bolt it down, turn on the switch, see what the color is, walk away and be done. That had some really great help on that aspect.
And if you could talk about the product roadmap, that would be great.
Say this again?
If you could talk about the product roadmap in terms of what's next for you guys.
So we've done paid trials with a bunch of companies and individuals that have gone exceptionally well. One thing is that this graph I showed you actually is 3D printed right here in Riverside. And 3D printed, of course, is wonderful, it's very flexible, but it's hard to scale beyond a few hundred. So the next thing to do actually is to take this crap and to basically be able to scale it to tens of thousands of production, which means injection molding. People normally do that in China. It's a bit difficult these days with COVID to actually outsource to China. So we're considering trying to do this in the US, which is a bit more difficult. But basically in the next few months, we hope to actually have injection molding versions of this so we can scale up to much other production for next year.
Sounds great. And my last question for you is, and again, this can be also in the context of academia as well, is if you think about projects or research that you've done that maybe didn't go as well, we may call it failure, but there's lessons learned that we derive from it. Is there anything that you can share with others from a wisdom?
I think the most important thing is actually to acknowledge our weaknesses and limitations and get a great team. So one thing about academia is there's a lot of smart people out there that have skills that you don't have. I'll give you a quick example. We placed this in a trap in Hawaii on a post, and it worked for 2 days and it stopped working. We couldn't figure out why. And it turns out actually that geckos were climbing up and sneaking inside to get a free moth for a meal. But the problem is the gecko got stuck in here and stopped it up from working. And A, we don't want to kill geckos, and B, I think it's a federal crime, protected species. So we have to solve the problem of how do you stop geckos from getting in here? Because geckos can climb almost anything. And it turns out actually that in our university, we have a gecko expert. We called him up, we asked him a question. He said, geckos cannot walk on Teflon. They can walk on everything except Teflon. So we simply put Teflon around the post, and that solved that problem. That's kind of one tiny example, but in terms of science and commercialization and everything else, I've had really dozens of people help me. I can't name them all because it's too many, but so in terms of success and failure, just getting good help from people really makes a big difference.
Great illustration and advice. So with that, I've been joined by Dr. Eamonn Keogh, who is a co-founder of FarmSense. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you so much.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.